going to dive in. We're going to talk about women in the Texas Revolution. And we're breaking this up as we have into 3 different stories. And the first story that I want to tell you guys is about Susannah Dickinson. And the thing about Susannah Dickinson is we almost always talk about her in the context of the Alma, right? Because she's the survivor who is sent with a message from Santa Anna to Sam Houston, and her daughter Angelina is so young. It's a real poignant story. But I want to encourage all of you guys to think about and share with your students a much bigger story about Susannah, because I think the wonderful thing about Susannah is that she experienced all of the Texas Revolution, not just the Alamo. She experienced the sort of broad breadth of the entire story. So I think she's a really good character to bring into our classrooms to tell our students much more about the broad story of the Alamo. And that's really a theme for today as well. I want to emphasize to you guys at the outset is that when we're looking at women in the Texas Revolution, it allows us to see this as a war that brought horrific destruction across Texas. We tend to usually think about the Texas Revolution as this very celebratory, there's a sacrifice at the Alamo, the massacre at Goliad, but the victory at San Jacinto, and there's a couple of battles, happens real fast, and then everything's great. The reality is the war destroyed the landscape of Texas, and there are huge numbers of people who are not directly in the fight who are experiencing all the chaos that comes with the war. And you see that in the experience of the women who aren't fighting on the front lines necessarily, but are being affected every day in every way by the war itself. And Susannah, I think, is a really good example of that and really helped us get into that storyline, right? So when I set up Susannah, what I want to do is I want to step back for a second, and I want to kind of set the scene in the summer of 1835, right? And the situation of women in Texas. And so when you think of the summer of 35, right as the war is about to get started, there's 3 different groups of women in Texas. There's Anglo-American women, African-American women, and Tejanas who are in Texas. And the largest group are the Anglo-American women. There's probably anywhere between 8,000 to 10,000 women, Anglo-American women, I mean, in Texas at this time period. And the vast majority of them, and I mean 90-something% of them, have come from the American South. So these are Southern women. They're from Virginia, they're from Tennessee, they're from Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Georgia. These are the kinds of places that they're from, and they've come out to the Texas frontier as a part of usually their husbands moving west to find farmlands, usually for growing cotton, right? So I've shown this image before of a Texas farm, but this is where these women's lives would have been centered, right? They would have been by themselves with their families out on their league of land that they'd been given by the Mexican government. They would live in a log cabin, much like this. If they were wealthy enough, they might have slaves that they manage on the plantation. But it's a very solitary life if you're living on the Texas frontier. Texas is the extreme frontier, right? It's the extreme frontier of the American movement west and of Mexico moving north. So it's on multiple frontiers, and you're out there very much by yourself. And that's something else I want to emphasize about women during the Revolution. They're very isolated and very much vulnerable because of that throughout this entire experience. And that's something I think we need to front with our students and give them a sense of just, not only are you out on the frontier, and as we'll talk about later, when their husbands go off to war, they're all by themselves and are deeply vulnerable and exposed for those very reasons, right? There are also the second largest group of women in Texas in the summer of 1835 are African Americans, and these are almost invariably enslaved women. We're going to talk about African Americans in much more depth tomorrow, and we're going to tell the story of one particular African American woman in Texas who was not a slave, which we'll get to tomorrow. But the vast majority were enslaved women. There's probably about 1,500 to maybe 2,000 African-American women in Texas at the time of the Revolution. They also live on farms. They're living with their white masters, and they're usually living in small groups. You don't have many plantations that have large numbers of slaves. So They're also living in small groups, usually in isolation, usually working very much in close proximity to their white mistress and their white master, working in the fields, usually in picking cotton. Most of the women in Texas who are enslaved are working in the fields. They're not necessarily working in houses as domestic servants, because most Texans didn't have enough money to have a really nice house with servants. If they bought an enslaved person, an enslaved woman, those people were usually working in the fields, picking cotton, taking care of children, but mostly working in the fields, just like African American men would have been. The third largest group, which is actually the smallest group, is Tejana Mexican, ethnic Mexican women who lived in Texas, and this is probably about 1,000 to 1,500 women, Tejana women who are living in Texas, and they're living in a very different situation. The Anglo women are living on farms. The African American women are living on those same farms, very isolated from most of anybody else. The Tejana women typically lived in urban places like San Antonio and La Bahia, right? So, not that San Antonio is a very large community, but they would have lived in an area where they would have had a lot more access to more women. They would have had more of a social circle. They would have had more of a support network amongst other Tejana women. There were a lot of ranches south of San Antonio on the San Antonio River that they would have, been a part of as well. And they would have gone between places like San Antonio and those ranches. But the Tejana women were pretty much clustered within both San Antonio, La Bahia, and then a few over in East Texas in Nacogdoches, right? This is the world in which Suzanne Dickinson comes to Texas in the early 1830s, right? And she is a Southern woman. She was born in Tennessee, and she marries rather young, I believe at 18. Her husband, Alma Dickinson. And so she becomes Susannah Dickinson, and she moves from Tennessee down to Texas. And one thing I want to emphasize to you guys is she was really young when she came to Texas. This is a picture of Susannah that most of us are familiar with, and she's, was taken later in her life. And so this is the mental image we usually have of her pretty much the whole time. But she was only 20 years old at the time. All right. And I want to emphasize that to you guys. Much like we said yesterday, Juan Seguin was only 15 years old when Stephen F. Austin rode into Texas. Susanna Dickinson is, at the time of the revolution, only 20 years old. So this picture here on the left, this is not Susanna on the left, but it's a period picture of somebody who's about 20 years old that I think gives us a better mental image of Susanna as a very young person, right? As a very young woman at the time of the Texas Revolution. And when she comes to Texas with her husband, Alma, they come to the extreme frontier of even the Anglo colonies. They come into Texas, they go past Austin's colony, and then settle in Green DeWitt's colony in Gonzales. And this is the far edge of even the Anglo settlements out there. So Susanna is really out there on the far, far flung frontier of the Texas settlements out there. And she's pregnant by early 1834, and she has a baby in December of 1834, December 14th, 1834. And so by the summer of 1835, when the Texas Revolution is about to begin, she's 20 years old, she's on the far frontier, and she's got a 6-month-old that she's taking care of, all right? For all of us who are parents and know what it's like to have a 6-month-old, under the best of circumstances, we know how challenging that is. So imagine doing that on the far frontier in a log cabin where you can't go get formula and diapers at Walmart or anything of the sort because you can't get pretty much anything, right? This is a tough situation under the best of circumstances. And then the revolution comes and pretty much sweeps up her entire world and ultimately will take almost everything besides her daughter from her, right? So the sacrifices that will be asked of Susanna are immense, and they begin very, very quickly, right? She and her husband are in Gonzales when that's right. Here's a famous picture of both Susanna and her daughter Angelina there, who's 6 months old at the time of all this. They're living in Gonzales on October 2nd, 1835, when the famous Battle of Gonzales happens and the come and take it flag and all that sort of stuff. Susanna's husband, Alma, he's involved in that. And so he's on the front lines of the Texas fight, literally from the very beginning, right? And this is going to affect Susanna immensely because in the aftermath of the Battle of Gonzales, right, there's a call to arms, right? And you've seen this newspaper piece before. Freedmen of Texas, to arms, to arms. Now's the day and now's the hour. And it's saying, all right, we need to fight now. And we need to push Santa Anna's troops out of San Antonio. So Almiron answers that call. He'd been in the fight at Gonzales, and now he goes over to San Antonio to be a part of the battle to push General Cos and his men out of San Antonio. So the Battle of Behar from December 5th to December 9th, he's out there as a part of that. Susanna and their little daughter, Angelina, stay back in Gonzales. They don't obviously go with her husband into the battle. So you look at the map right here, you know, her husband's in San Antonio. Susanna's by herself in Gonzales, all by herself, doing everything by herself with their daughter, right? Out on the far frontier. And they're very vulnerable for that, right? This is the edge of Comanche territory. And raids were not uncommon. And they're obviously concerned about that. But there's a war that's broken out. And you can imagine how she must have felt at night, wondering what was going to happen. And as it turns out, she had good reason to be worried because it was Texas volunteers, Anglo-Americans, who would go out to San Antonio to be a part of the army that was going to attack Santa Anna's troops in San Antonio. And as some of those troops went through Gonzales, there was one particular incident where American troops going out to San Antonio got drunk in Gonzales and tore the town up and ran into different houses and buildings, broke into places, stole things, assaulted women. And we know this because people wrote about it. There was a letter written to Stephen F. Austin by a guy named Lancelot Smither. By the way, I just want to pause for a second and say that we need better names today, like Lancelot Smither. That's the best name I've ever heard anyone ever have. Lancelot Smither, right? I want to give his parents an award for the best naming of a child ever. Anyway, this is a letter that Lancelot wrote to Stephen F. Austin. He was describing what happened in Gonzales, and he said, such savage and hostile conduct. Numbers of men broke open almost every house in town in Gonzales, included Susanna's house, and they robbed all they could lay their hands on. And such insults were never offered to American women before, all right? So when this happens, you can imagine Susanna, who has a baby in her arms, dealing with all of this, right? And so word gets back to Almiron. He realizes leaving his wife and daughter on the far-flung frontier to fend for themselves was probably not the best decision he could have made. And so after the Battle of Behar in San Antonio, he sends for Susanna. And so Susanna leaves Gonzales. They leave their home and they come to San Antonio with her daughter, Angelina, to protect them. So my point is this: Susanna's in San Antonio because the violence of the revolution has already assaulted her at her very doorstep. And she has to abandon her home in Gonzales in order to come out to San Antonio, just to be mildly safer and be closer to her husband, right? So in December of 1835, Susanna and Angelina come to San Antonio. They take up residence kind of right here in the center of San Antonio at the house of a powerful, influential Tejano named Ramon Musquiz. And, you know, they stay in the house, and Susanna works basically as sort of tending to the house and all the visitors who come through. Davy Crockett, when he comes into San Antonio, will stay at the house, and Susanna will both meet him and help take care of him while he's boarding at that particular house. So that's why Susanna and Angelina are in San Antonio when Santa Anna comes marching into town, and everybody in San Antonio moves out and then heads to the east part of town. You guys can see right here, Alamo is on the very edge, just beyond the San Antonio River, on the very edge of San Antonio itself, right? Almiron, according to accounts later, rides up to Susanna, throws him and their daughter on his horse, and rides them into the Alamo, and they go in from there, all right? And so when they go into the Alamo, right, can imagine what Susanna's feeling. They don't know what's happening. They don't know what's going to go on. She's already been run out because of violence from Gonzalez. It had to be a very terrifying experience. And then you add the fact she's got a baby in her arms that she has to take care of, feed, clothe, everything that comes with a baby, and how vulnerable that must have felt to be bringing her into the Alamo complex itself, right? Now, she wasn't the only woman who went into the Alamo. There were upwards of about a dozen non-combatants who were in the Alamo. It's sort of hard to get exact numbers because we have conflicting reports, and the truth is we'll never quite know exactly everybody who was in the Alamo. But we know there was probably at least 6 other women who were in the Alamo, most of whom were Tejanas from San Antonio who had been caught up like Susannah and run into the Alamo. One of the more famous and I think better examples is this woman here, Juana Navarro, of the Navarro family, who she and her sister Gertrudis went into the Alamo as a part of taking care of Jim Bowie. They had been raised by the Veramendi family and had been close to Jim Bowie, who had married into the Veramendis. And so Juana goes into the Alamo along with several other Tejana women. So there's a cluster of women actually who are in the Alamo complex at the time of the siege. And, they experienced the entire siege. We always talk about, Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and William Barrett Travis and all the men in the Alamo. And we should, that's very important. But the women experienced all of these terrors as well. The constant bombardment of the Alamo complex that started day one and didn't end until the very, very end of the siege. They experienced all of that. The terror of whether or not they're going to be killed. Are we going to get reinforced? Are we running out of food? All these things are things they're worried about, and they're worried about if they have husbands in there, what's going to happen to them. In the case of Susannah, what's going to happen to her child? I mean, you can imagine day in and day out being terrified. And what's, I think, most terrifying in all of this is that you have so little, if any, control over the situation. What influence can you have except to try to survive whatever comes at you, right? And so they're, of course, there when the dawn of March 6th comes, 1836, and the great fight happens in the pre-dawn darkness. As the cannons open up and the roar of Santa Anna's troops as they attack the walls of the Alamo itself and attack 3 times. And then, as you can see here in this map here, finally swarm over the wall, starting on the north side of the Alamo complex in the 3rd assault that they make on the Alamo compound. Juana, Susannah, all the women in the Alamo complex are not out fighting. They are ensconced in the building. Susannah is in the Alamo chapel. Juana's probably over here near the entrance of the Alamo complex itself. And, they hear all of this fighting. You can imagine being in these buildings right here and hearing the cannons going off, the rifle reports, the screaming and the moans and all the violence that's going on, that you hear all of that. And it's getting closer all the time, right? Susannah later testified, she gave a lot of testimony after the Alamo, that she saw no part of the fight itself, but she could distinctly hear it. And so what I do with my students is I have them close their eyes and I describe the Alamo fight and imagine it in their own minds and try to go through that experience of what Susannah would have experienced in imagining that. But for her, it was far more real because she literally heard all of this going on. There are reports that her husband came rushing into the Alamo chapel after Santa Anna's troops got over the walls and said that, they're over the walls, and basically said goodbye and then ran out to his certain death. Again, you can imagine being 20 years old with a child in your arms and seeing your husband come in saying goodbye and then rushing out, and she never ever saw him again. Juana later recalled and testified that, quote, she could hear the noise of the conflict, the roar of the artillery, the rattle of the small arms. And this is the part that really gets me, the shouts of the combatants, the groans of the dying and the moans of the wounded, right? I think that's the terrifying thing because you don't know what's going to happen to you. The last of the fighting happened right in front of the Alamo chapel. And this is something Susannah would have heard most distinctly, right? She's in here in a room cloistered off, as she said, very dark. So it was all shut up as much as it could be. What she saw at the very end of the fight was that one of the last men alive ran to the back of the chapel, a man by the name of Walker, trying to get away and save his life. And the Mexican soldiers chased him to the back and then stabbed him to death with their bayonets, and then carried him out with him on their bayonets, pushed up into the air. And she later testified that she actually saw that happen. And so at the end of the fight, she doesn't know if she's going to be killed. There's an officer who speaks in English who comes and finds her and tells her to come on out. And so she comes out and walked out in front of the Alamo Chapel here. She has to step over dead bodies in order to do so. She's shot, grazed, but she's shot in the leg as she's coming out from a ricochet of a bullet. So she's actually wounded on her way out of the Alamo itself. And you can imagine the horrific shock as she steps out, and there's black smoke everywhere because everyone's firing black powder rifles, and it's just this air of smoke everywhere, and there's just dead bodies every which direction you can possibly imagine. And she sees the chaos of it all. She later testifies she saw Crockett's body laying there on the ground, and all the carnage that went with it. So she, Juana, Gertrudis, all the Alamo survivors are taken out of the Alamo, and then they're brought into town, back to basically downtown San Antonio, where they're put up again in the Ramon Musqui's house and shut up in there for a short while. It's not clear what's going to happen to them. Susannah's distraught. She asks and requests from her guard, can I go back to the Alamo, presumably to see the body of her husband. But she's refused because they're already burning the bodies. All the bodies of the defenders of the Alamo were stacked up into big piles and then set aflame. And so her guard said, no, you can't go to the Alamo. And he brings her outside and shows her the plumes of smoke that are rising above the Alamo and tells her those are the bodies being burned. Again, you can imagine how it would feel for her to see that and know her husband's body is burning as she's out here and has lost virtually everything, right? All the survivors of the Alamo had the distinct honor of then being interviewed by Santana himself. And so Santana came into the room, sat down, and then each of the survivors were brought before him where he interviewed them, such as it was. Juana was one of the first people brought before Santa Anna. And, he asked her some questions and she answered as best she could. He gave her 2 silver pesos and a blanket. Every survivor was handed 2 silver pesos and a blanket. And then she was dismissed and basically allowed to go home because her home was San Antonio, so she could leave the Musqui's house and go back to her house. Right after the Navarro sisters, Susannah was brought before Santa Anna, and she's clutching her daughter, Angelina, in her arms, and she's brought in before the dictator. And you can imagine sitting across the table from the general who led the assault that killed everybody in the Alamo, killed her husband, right? And now you're sitting across from this guy. And he asks her, where her husband is, and she says he's dead in the Alamo. And he asks her about her daughter, Angelina. And then Santa Anna offers to adopt Angelina and take her back to Veracruz, where he promises to raise her in opulent circumstances. And Susannah declines said offer and says, no, thank you. I'm not interested. And so Santa Anna says, okay, well, I need you to take a message. All right. I need you to take a message to the rest of Texas. And this is important. Susannah is anointed by Santa Anna as the messenger of what happened at the Alamo. And then, we always say, remember the Alamo, obviously. But Santa Anna really does want people to remember the Alamo. And the reason he wants them to remember it is that for him, this was a warning to the rest of Texas. Defy me, and this will be your fate. And so Santa Anna literally told Susannah, gave her a message to deliver to Sam Houston. It says, the treatment accorded the rebels at the Alamo will be the treatment to which the remainder of the country will be subjected, right? And she was to be the messenger of that to the rest of Texas. So Susannah is sent east with her daughter, sent toward the Anglo colonies with this message, and she leaves San Antonio 2 days after the battle. About 5 miles out of San Antonio, heading east, she encounters Joe, who was the slave of William Barrett Travis, who had also survived the Alamo battle. We're going to talk a lot about Joe tomorrow. We're going to tell his story in detail tomorrow, so we'll revisit him when we get there. But Susanna and Joe both make their way toward Gonzales. And when they arrive, they encounter Sam Houston, the general of the Texian army, who had just arrived in Gonzales and was raising his army. He'd been coming to relieve the Alamo, but Susanna tells him, everyone's been killed. She delivers the message from Santa Anna, and that now Santa Anna has nothing between him and the colonies, and he's going to start marching east. And so Sam Houston decides, okay, I'm going to burn Gonzales. I'm going to retreat. And when Sam Houston does that, he burns Susanna's house. All right, so I want to remind you guys again, Susanna experienced the full breadth of the revolution. She experiences the Battle of Gonzales and its aftermath, right? She experiences the violence on the frontier that chases her out of her own home. She goes to San Antonio to be with her family and then has to take refuge in the Alamo. The battle takes everything from her, takes her husband from her, and she is now with her and her daughter alone. And then when she goes back to Gonzales, I would assume deeply traumatized by all the things she's experienced, then her house is burned by the Texas Army as they retreat east, and she has to retreat east with them as a part of the Runaway Scrape, which is what we're going to talk about next. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Phillips, who's going to give you guys a couple resources that we can use for talking about this stuff.
All right, thanks, Andrew, and good morning. I'm super excited about this portion of the whole lesson because women of the revolution are they're my thing, and Susanna, she's kind of my hero. So let's talk about her today. I saw a lot of people in the chat saying, she's a strong woman, and using all of these things to reference her, and yeah, she totally is. She's she's one of those people that every time I dig a little bit deeper about her, I find out just how incredibly strong she is. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. All of this information, again, is inside of the classroom, the Google Classroom, and Jay, I believe, shared it inside of the chat. So if you're looking for it, it's day 3, and we're just going to start on the lesson plan. I've got, because I'm super excited about Susanna, I've got several things for you guys this morning for her. We're going to start with the hook exercise. So if you'll click on that and open it, or you can view my screen either way. The hook exercise that I designed for Susanna really mirrors or aligns with, actually, I'm going to go back to this. It aligns with the moment when Santana gives her the letter and gives her the commission after the Battle of the Alamo to head back and find the General Houston, find the Texian army. I'm not going to give you any direction where they are, but go find them. Okay, go through the woods and by yourself. Actually, he gives her a couple of escorts, but they abandon her as soon as they get out of San Antonio. So she's alone. She's alone on the journey. She meets up with Joe along the way, a slave, and so luckily she has his company on the way for a good portion of it, but she's alone in the woods with a baby after the battle, while she's grieving, all that kind of stuff. So she's dealing with a lot. The hook exercises really aligns with that. The scenario is that the students will be going on this week-long race. They have a grand prize at the very end. They get some acres in Texas and some money, none of which Susanna really got. But the dates for the scenario are March 7th through March 14th, which would have been about the time that Susanna goes on her trek through the woods to find the Texian army. And then they're commissioned to go from point A to point B, which is a 75-mile from start to finish journey on foot. And they're given restrictions. You can only bring 3 things. You and your partners are going to choose which 3 things you're going to bring and detail why, all that kind of stuff. This really just kind of gets them thinking about referencing back to the layout of Texas and the land and what they're going to be dealing with and all of the extra things that they're dealing with. They're not just going from point A to point B on horseback or whatever. They're walking through the woods, spending the night, camping out, all that kind of stuff. They're going to have weather to deal with, rivers to cross and whatnot. So they've got three things. Susanna had a little bit of money, a blanket, and of course he gave her the letter. So they're commissioned with taking a letter from point A to point B, all in one piece, which is really hard because if it rains, the letter gets wet, all that kind of stuff. So that is kind of the outline for the hook exercise for you. And we're going to move on to the next part, which is the background essay. Here's the background essay for Susanna Dickinson. I did provide a lot of information. I'll tell you this. I would use this as a supplemental document for my students because I love to tell the story of Susanna from start to finish, and I do that in my classroom. So if I'm doing, or when I'm doing this exercise in my classroom, I just simply give them this to refer back to as they're looking through and analyzing the primary sources. I added some questions along the bottom of it for you guys if you want to use this as an activity, or again, you can just use the bio information specifically as a supporting document. One of the fun things that I like to do in my class, because later on we're going to end with how Susanna ended up. But there's a little, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek right now. There's a little information below in the very last paragraph. Her final marriage, students love to know about this. She was married 5 times, but her final marriage was to somebody who was 20 years younger than her. And so we do the math, which is kind of a cool thing about her. And one of the things that I love, like, go Susanna, you got a young one. But I love to have them do the math. Like, okay, Susanna is about 20 years old at the Battle of the Alamo. And he is months old, about 18 months old actually at that time. How old was her last husband during that time? And so, you see this look on their face, and it's fun, and it's kind of a cool reaction, and it gets them to thinking more of the human perspective. And then moving on to the third document. So I'm going to jog back to the lesson plan. The third document is the primary source analysis. So if you want to click on that, that's what I'm taking a look at now. That's what we're looking at. There are 3 documents in here. 2 of them are accounts from Susanna. The first one is a very colorful account. Obviously, all of these accounts from Susanna were given later in life. She could not read or write, and she did not keep a journal because of that. And so these accounts were given much later in life. The first one was from a journalist. She sat down with a journalist and gave her account. And it's very obvious that he added some of his extra into this account. And so I chose this one on purpose so that you could point that out to your students and compare it to document C, which is much more of a straightforward account that she gives. I'm going to go back to document B though, because this is quite literally one of my favorite accounts of Susanna. It's not written by her. It's written by Enrique Esparza, who was one of the survivors of the Alamo. And he was about 11 years old while he was in the Alamo. He's the son of Giorgio Esparza. In the Alamo Reader, which is a book that I've gotten a lot of my information from, it has all of his accounts of what happened during the Alamo, and they're quite fascinating from the point of view of an 11-year-old boy. First of all, he was fearful for his life. And then second of all, he was very obviously concerned about his mother and her well-being, and all of the other women and children that were there too. As an 11-year-old, he knows that all the men are dying, and he's kind of stepping up into a role of caretaker. And so you can see that in here. He gives his account of what happens afterwards, right? They're in the church, and then they're brought out of the church. A couple of the boys around his age were killed by the Mexican soldiers, and so that's why he was fearful. He also says in here that he looked like an 8-year-old, and so he thinks that that's what saved his life. Many 11-year-old boys want to look older than what they actually are, but he was thankful he looked like an 8-year-old that day, I'm positive. But he gives an account of Susanna and the way and the interaction of Susanna with Santana, and he talks about how Santana perceives her differently, or he acts differently towards her. Right here, where is it? It says that Mrs. Dickerson is how he says it. Dickinson is her last name, but I want to point that out really quickly because there's a lot of discrepancies in spelling of her last name, and we're going to see that differently throughout the primary sources. This is something that you want to talk to your students about and say, hey, listen, it's spelled differently here because they didn't really have they didn't have Google for one. I can Google anybody's name and figure out how to spell it really quickly, but they didn't have that reference. And so they just spelled it as they would. And so he talks about how Santana addresses her in a different tone of voice than he does the other women. He sees the Tejanos and Tejano children and Tejanas as traitors, but he kind of sweet talks Susannah a little bit. He lightens up and offers to take her baby, which is one of the big moments that resonates with me personally, because I cannot imagine being in front of the leader of the Mexican troops, and he's saying, well, let me just take your baby. I know I killed your husband, but let me take your baby. And she stands up and says, no, absolutely not. That's crazy business. And then he sends them all away with $2 and a blanket. So that's the purpose of these accounts that I've chosen here, is simply to see the perspective that Susannah gave of the accounts from the Alamo, and then the kind of afterwards, or the additional perspective of Enrique Esparza. I think that the students will really resonate with this one, especially. And then the very last document that I've got for you guys is here. So I've got an exit ticket for you. The exit ticket is based on Susannah Dickinson, but it's also really based in the perspective of what I want my students to do is think about primary sources and the time that they were written. Susannah didn't keep a journal, like I said, because she was illiterate and she could not read. She could not read or write, and so all of her accounts are later, decades later, from the time of the battle or the time of the revolution. And what I want my students to know is that if they're thinking a story just last week, or for me yesterday, sometimes I get things wrong. I get things mixed up and I don't remember them exactly how they were. And so this is prompting them to think about primary sources in that way. Do you think primary sources written at the time of the event are more reliable or more credible than those accounts written later? Why or why not? That kind of thing. So that's really what I want to frame Susannah Dickinson's story with, and then really set the stage and clear up the idea of who Susannah was and what she did and all of the things that she went through. Later on in the next session, we'll talk a little bit about the Runaway Scrape. That one was all about women and their struggle and their survival and just their strength throughout the entire revolution. It's pretty incredible. Before I give it back to Andrew, I want to show you guys this book very quickly. This is like my holy grail for women of the Texas Revolution. This is one of the best compiled books that there was for the accounts of women during the revolution. And so if you don't have it, get it. It's edited by Mary Shear. And maybe if Jay finds it, he can post the link for you guys, but that's definitely a good read and something that I certainly suggest. So I'm gonna stop right there and I'm going to hand this one back to Andrew so he can tell you guys all about the details of the Runaway Scrape.
Fabulous. Yes. Thank you, Michelle. And I highly recommend that book as well. It's as she just said, absolutely fantastic. I think Jay just shared a link for it. All right, so there you go. Well, that's the Alma reader too. He just shared. was also fantastic. Okay, so let's pick up the story now and go forward and talk about the Runaway Scrape. And the thing about the Runaway Scrape is that it's one of the most important events of the Texas Revolution that we almost never talk about. Or if we do, we spend 32 seconds on it. And I know there's too much to cover and we don't have enough time, and I totally get that. But the experience of the Runaway Scrape, I think what's really valuable about it is that it demonstrates how chaotic and destructive the war really was. We tend to forget that. And my students tend to think it was just, again, Battle of the Alamo, Massacre of Goliad, San Jacinto, done. There's just 3 little spots where this happened. And in fact, all the landscape of Texas went through devastation because of the war. And that affected more than anybody, I'd say, the women who lived on the home front of most of the war and experienced all of these things, right? So all those 3 groups that we talked about at the very beginning are going to experience the aftermath of the war itself. And while they're on the home front, women are contributing to the war itself. This is something else I think we need to emphasize and let people know, is that women were contributing to the war throughout, right? This is, I love this letter that was in the Texas Telegraph, written by, as you can see, signed at the bottom on the right there, a lady of Texas. And it's this really interesting letter, and you can take time to read it outside of the Institute, because it's in the PowerPoint, you'll be able to see it. The piece I use with my class regularly is where she says that the ladies of Texas can render service to their threatened country by making up clothing for her army. The women of Texas would, if necessary, do $10,000 worth of work for those who stand between them and danger. And what she's talking about is that women aren't going to be fighting on the front lines with a Kentucky long rifle in their hands, but that supporting the war effort, supporting the men in the field, but supporting in terms of supplies and clothing and food and all that sort of stuff makes a massive difference during the war. And women are involved in that throughout the entire war effort, even though we don't see a whole lot of that in the day-to-days that we end up talking about. Women also managed the plantations and the farms in the absence of their husbands during the war. As we saw with Alma leaving, Susanna is left to fend for herself. And that happened to lots and lots of women across Texas. And for those who lived on plantations, that meant being in charge of the enslaved people who lived on places like Jared Gross's plantation. And that was no small thing. The Mexican army, as it marched into Texas, and again, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, enslaved people would run away to the Mexican army when they got the chance, particularly around Victoria when Urrea's army moves in there. And so women were left to manage all aspects of life without their husbands, including the farms and the enslaved populations. And then women were also in charge of just dealing with the farms and doing the picking of the cotton. The revolution really gets going in the spring of 36. That's the period when we're supposed to be planting cotton for the next year and planting corn for eating. And so women are tending the farms in the fields with their children and basically making up for the lack of their husbands. And so that's an added burden on top of all the uncertainty that the war brings itself to these women's lives, right? And then, as if that wasn't enough, they're being encouraged on a regular basis to send their men into the army, particularly after the fall of the Alamo. So this is something that showed up in the Texas newspapers during this period. That's reprinting part of a letter from a guy named Mosley Baker. And what he says is, to the women of Texas, permit no man to stay at home, but bid them go where duty and honor calls them to participate in the dangers as well as the benefits of Texas. What he's saying is, hey, ladies, if your husband won't go voluntarily into the army, force him to do it. Shame him into doing it. Tell him if he's a real man, he'll go do it. And enlisting, women in the state in Texas to push their men basically out the door into the armies. Again, that is a massive sacrifice on the behalf of the women who did encourage their husbands to go into the fight. But the problem is a lot of those men died. They died at the Alamo, and Susannah Dickinson brought news of that to Sam Houston. But from there, it spreads across Texas, moving east. News of the fall of the Alamo burned its way across the landscape fairly quickly, right? And that produced panic in all kinds of people, right? When Sam Houston starts retreating east, because he knows he doesn't have an army that can fight Santa Anna yet, So he starts retreating east. Then you hear about the Texas Army going east. So you heard about the Alma falling. Now you heard about Sam Houston and the Texas Army retreating. And then news arrives of the massacre of James Fannin and the 400 Texas soldiers that had been in Goliad. And so it is the combination of all these different pieces of news that spread panic across Texas amongst most Texas farms and settlers. And this leads to what's known as the Runaway Scrape, right? Which is a real fancy way to say, I call it the Great Skedaddle. They're all trying to move east to get away from Santa Anna's army because they know it's marching in. And I want to emphasize, that was Santa Anna's plan. He was trying to scare everybody to death so that they would run away. So that's why he gives Susannah that message. That's why he burns all the bodies at the Alamo. That's why he does what he does. We don't have to approve of his methods because they're horrific, but they were effective in trying to achieve his strategic aims. And so if all, the Alamo and Goliad have been killed, Sam Houston's retreating, news of that gets to your house, you're terrified. And you don't know where the Mexican army is, right? This is not the current era, where you can Google information and figure out what the traffic looks like when you're going to go down 35 or I-10. You have no idea where the Mexican army is. You just know it's marching this way. You want to get out fast. You want to get out as quickly as possible. And so when news arrives, panic hits people hard. They throw whatever they can grab into a saddlebag or the back of a wagon, and they get out fast so they can move east. I always ask my students, think about that. If you had 20 minutes to vacate your home, what would you take? And you can only bring things you can either carry or you can pull in a wagon. All right. What are you going to grab? What are you going to take with you? These are impossible choices, right? People mostly just threw their families into wagons and then just took off as fast as they could. And that is what the landscape of Texas looked like during the Revolution, right? You see all these homes that are just abandoned. So there's a really famous memoir of Texas from this period by a guy named Noah Smithwick here. And he has a wonderful, heart-wrenching, but wonderful description of what it looked like in the aftermath of the Runaway Scrape. It says if you rode through these places, you'd see houses standing open, the beds unmade, the breakfast things still on the tables, pans of milk molding in the dairies, cribs full of corn, smokehouses full of bacon, yards full of chickens. It's just abandoned, like someone just walked out the door in the middle of everything and left it all. Like food on the table. And, Noah Smithwick was a really good storyteller, so we could dismiss that as him being dramatic, except that there were other people who said the exact same thing. So there's a guy named Guy M. Bryan, who was the nephew of Stephen F. Austin, and his dad was a guy named James Perry, and they lived down kind of where Angleton is today. You guys know where that is, southwest of Houston. He was 16 at the time of the Runaway Scrape, and he wrote later, the same basic thing Noah Smithwick said. Some families left their home with their table spread for the daily meal. Like, it's set for breakfast, but everyone's gone like ghosts, right? All hastily prepared for flight as if the enemy were at their door. That's something I think I want to emphasize to you guys. It felt like the enemy was at the door at any moment. They were afraid of Santa Anna's armies marching in. They were also afraid, this was rumors that flew at this time, that the Comanches were using the chaos of the revolution as an opportunity to raid. And so basically, people felt at any moment someone could ride up and kill all of us. And for women whose husbands were gone in particular, they had to feel remarkably vulnerable. They're responsible for themselves, and they're responsible for whatever children they had. And bringing them and saving them in any way, shape, or form as possible became the highest priority for women during the Great Runaway Scrape. And so they left as fast as they could. And there's not a lot of imagery of the Runaway Scrape. This is a painting that was done that looks mildly romantic, I would say. Like, we're taking a nice walk heading towards Louisiana. And what I want to emphasize to you guys is that the situation of the Runaway Scrape was much harsher than that. The spring of 1836 was incredibly rainy. I don't know if we had a very rainy spring this year and a very rainy summer. So it was even more so in the spring of 1836. It just rained constantly. And that's important because it meant that the roads in Texas, such as they were absolute muddy bogs throughout this entire period. So not only are you leaving your home and throwing what you got in wagons or in saddlebags or just walking, but you're going to be navigating these roads that are incredibly muddy, and they're being tromped on by thousands of people. So they're muddy bogs that become just destroyed and basically, knee-deep mud throughout because all these people and animals are trudging along them, making their way, trying to go east, trying to save themselves. And everybody, I want to emphasize, is desperately panicked as they're experiencing all of this. All right, there's an emotional tenor to this whole experience that's hard to describe. People would get their wagons stuck in the mud and literally be unable to move them because the mud would be up to the axles of the wagons, and they would just abandon them. They would abandon all kinds of things that they were dragging to lighten the load. So think about it. You've got like 20 minutes to throw everything you have in your wagon and run. And then as you're going along, you just start throwing that stuff out of the wagon because it's slowing you down and you're terrified it might kill you, that you brought an extra trunk of stuff. So you just throw it out and you're just abandoning what little you have as you're escaping east until eventually you have almost nothing. There's a lot of really beautiful accounts of what it looked like during the Runaway Scrape as everyone's running east. These are just two examples that I use with my classes that I think are really, really powerful. The first one by Angelina Payton Eberly. She's a wonderful character all by herself. I recommend looking her up in the Handbook of Texas. But she says, much was left on the riverbanks, which she means is people just abandoned stuff because it made it harder to get across rivers. There were no wagons hardly, few horses. Many had to go on foot with the mud up to their knees. Women and children, pell-mell. And then below here, you can see an account by a guy named Creed Taylor, who was a soldier in the Texas Army. And it's a really beautiful, heart-wrenching, but beautiful account. He said, I never witnessed such scenes of distress and human suffering. Delicate women trudged, and I would argue with him that these women are delicate. They're tough as nails, but trudged alongside their park horses, carts and sleds from day to day until their shoes were literally worn out. And then they continued the journey with bare feet, lacerated and bleeding at almost every step. At the end here, this is, I think, a really great quote. These half-clad, mud-smeared fugitives, looking like veritable savages, trudged along, right? There's nothing romantic about these experiences. And the point of this for me with my students is that, women were caught up in all the violence and the threats of violence the Texas Revolution brought with it. And these got particularly tense at the rivers in Texas. Because as everybody's moving east, they've got to get across these rivers. And today we have bridges. They're very easy to drive over. That's wonderful. None of that existed in 1836. If you're going to get across a river, you got to do it on a ferry like this, which is just a big raft with some guy pulling you across on a rope. That's a slow way to get across when lots of people are backed up. And so you had people piled up for days by the hundreds and sometimes thousands at these river crossings where everyone's panicking because they're afraid that coming up behind them is going to be Mexican soldiers under Santa Anna attacking them, right? And then it just kept asking more and more of these women as they made their way east. And I'm going to give you guys two examples, Amra, Mcelroy, and Pamela Mann. So the woman right here is neither of them. We don't have a picture of either of these women, but I'm going to put this picture in as sort of a stand-in for Amra and Pamela to give you just a visual to think about. Now, I'll tell you quickly about Amra Mcelroy. She was 22 years old at the time of the revolution, all right? She had several children, and they lived in San Felipe. Her husband died during the revolution, and so she becomes a widow. And as the Texas Army is retreating, San Felipe gets burned on March 29th as a part of that. And so she loses her home, right? And loses everything in it. She's lost her husband, and she's making her way east, trying to escape this violence with what little she has left with her children, all by herself. Somebody said in the chat earlier, just going to HEB with my child is hard. I thought was a brilliant comment. And I agree completely because I've got two kids of my own. I can't imagine doing all of this. And she's going east. When she gets to Lynch's Ferry, which is right on the San Jacinto River, almost at the site of the Battle of San Jacinto. She gets there before the battle. And she's trying to get across. She has a wagon and 2 oxen. She's trying to get across the river. The Texas Army catches up with her, and they take her wagon and they take her oxen because the Army needs it, not this widowed woman and her 2 children. They take it from her, and she's got nothing. She's just on foot with her kids, and they never return her wagon. They never return her oxen. She later makes a claim against the Texas government for $325 to reimburse her, and her claim was denied by the Republic of Texas. So she never got anything back from any of that, right? The other story about Pamela
Andrew, you're frozen.
And so she followed. Am I frozen?
No, you're good now. You're good
Okay.
now. You're back.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So I was telling about Pamela Mann, and she's making her way east, and her wagon and some oxen had been taken by the Texas Army, and so she follows the Texas Army because she wants her wagon back. And she had been told by the Texas Army, by Sam Houston, that they were going to retreat to Nacogdoches. So she's following them, making sure that's true. And she's keeping an eye on her oxen right here and her wagon. And at one point, Sam Houston decides he's going to turn southward toward Santa Anna's army and toward a fight. And Pamela Mann realizes that when the army turns, she's probably never going to see her oxen and her wagon again. So she goes to demand her oxen back. And the Texas Army says, "I'm sorry, we're using it. We can't give it back to you." And so she says, no, I need it back. And they say, no. And then she starts swearing at them, and they say no. And then she pulls out a pair of pistols and aims it at a guy. And they say, okay, you know what? I think we'll give you your wagon back. So they return her oxen, they return her wagon. And this is actually a receipt for her getting paid $100 from the Republic of Texas for the use of her oxen during this period as the Texas military was coming back. Pamela Mann was not going to put up with anything that she didn't have to put up with in these circumstances. All right. Now, where were all these people going? Right? Where are they going to in the Runaway Scrape? There's not like one destination. They're going east as fast as they can. Some are planning and do go to Louisiana. Some are just trying to get further east and then see what happens. But they continue to push east as Houston's army continues to retreat east. One of the reasons that Houston got a lot of guff from people in Texas during that retreat, because it's forcing all the refugees to move east as well. All right. And some of them are so close to San Jacinto when the battle breaks out that they can literally hear the cannons going off during the battle itself. And we're going to talk about a woman named Dalou Rose next, who heard those cannons. That's how close some of them are to the battlefield itself. All right. I love to point out to my students that the flag that the Texans flew during the Battle of San Jacinto had a woman on it. And I think that's a really appropriate image for the larger revolution, that women made immense sacrifices, even if they weren't on the battlefield itself at San Jacinto or at Alma or Goliad. They're very much in the mix of all of these things and all the sacrifices. In fact, the Battle of San Jacinto happened to take place on the farm lands of a woman named Peggy McCormick, who was an Irish woman who had come to Texas with her husband and 2 sons in 1823. So she's one of the very early settlers in Texas around Austin's colony. Her husband, Arthur, then promptly died the next year in 1824. So she is a single woman who owns this land, because under the Mexican period and then later, women can own their own property in Texas because of the Spanish system. But she's there raising her 2 sons as a single woman, and she owns this land. And so when Sam Houston arrives and then Santa Anna arrives on her farmland, she and her sons skedaddle and get out of there before the battle. When they come back, their farm has been ravaged, right? All of her cattle, all right, 230 head of cattle have been eaten, killed and slaughtered and eaten by both armies. So she's got none of her cattle left. And then her entire farm is littered with the dead of the battle. There were 630 soldiers of Santa Anna's army that had been killed during the battle, and none of them were buried by the Texas Army. They were left to rot in the open fields. And Pamela Mann here, I'm sorry, Peggy McCormick here, I apologize. Peggy here comes back and she wants her farm back. And she wants Sam Houston to do something about all the dead soldiers on her property. So she goes up to Houston and says, you need to bury all these guys. And Houston doesn't want to do it. He wants to make Santa Anna bury the dead, which Santa Anna doesn't want to do either. So Houston refuses, and he tries to tell Peggy McCormick, he says, look, your farm is going to be famous. It's the battlefield of San Jacinto. It's going to be renowned the world over. And Peggy here has more practical things to deal with. And she says, you know, I'm not buying that. She literally yells at him, to the devil with your glorious history. So she's screaming this at Sam Houston. All right, that takes chutzpah right there. All right. And she's saying, I need you to bury the dead. Houston doesn't do it. So Peggy has to deal with the aftermath of that, which goes on for quite a long time. And that's, I think, one of the main stories we also need to tell about the Texas Revolution and the experiences of women, is that the aftermath of the Texas Revolution had devastated the landscape of Texas, and women and men and children, everybody who's involved, goes back to a destroyed landscape that these two armies have ravaged over the course of a very short but very violent war. People went back to their homes after the Runaway Scrape and found them defiled and destroyed. Houston's army had burned a lot of towns. Santa Anna's army had burned a lot of settlements in places like Harrodsburg. Farms that had been marched past by the armies had been ravaged for food and supplies of all sorts, so they got torn to pieces since they were abandoned, right? And people who returned to these landscapes lost so much, right? I think one of my favorite examples of that is a woman named Fanny Sutherland, who, this is not a picture of her because we don't have a picture of Fanny, but I'm using this picture kind of as a stand-in for Fanny. But she lost a son at the Alamo. And then when news of the fall of the Alamo came, she and her three little girls have to leave to escape the violence. Her husband, George, he goes and joins the army. And so she's by herself in this Runaway Scrape, and she wanders around for 2 months in the countryside, covering hundreds of miles with her and three little girls, all by themselves, no support, no money, no nothing, trying to survive in all of this. And she does survive, right? They survive the Runaway Scrape. San Jacinto ends the battle, or the war, and then she comes back to her home. But when she gets back, it's destroyed. Right? I mean, imagine enduring all of that for 2 months, and then you get back to your home, and this is what she's described when she got home. She said, we found nothing in the world worth speaking of, not one mouthful of anything to eat. God knows how we will make out, right? So my point is, the effects of the war don't end at San Jacinto. They go on from there, and the violence that it produced had long-term consequences for every Texan, right? And women felt that most acutely on the home front. And the men at the time understood that and had seen that firsthand. I think one of my favorite examples is Thomas Jefferson Rusk, who was, you guys have heard of Thomas Jefferson Rusk. He's a very influential Texan during the Revolution period. And this is his quote about that. He says, the men of Texas deserved much credit for the Revolution, but more was due the women. Armed men facing a foe could not help but be brave, but the women, with their little children around them, without means of defense or power to resist, face danger and death with unflinching courage. And I think that's, again, another part of the revolution that we need to make clear, is that it wasn't just the soldiers at those particular battles or the massacre at Goliad, and those are very important. I'm not denigrating any of that, but I'm saying the war was bigger than that. Right? The war affected far more than that. The war affected everybody. And telling the story of women and all of that, I think, gives a broad sense of the destruction that this war really encompassed for everybody, and why understanding that really matters for being able to tell a full story of the revolution itself, right? And we're going to be able to get into that a little bit even more deeply with the story of the Dalou Rose that we'll talk about here in just a moment. But with that, I wanted to hand it back over to Michelle to take us into some more documents you guys and lessons materials you guys can use in your classroom.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. I saw the chat in the chat. A lot of you were saying, my gosh, that's like a horrible situation. Yeah, it is. Many times in classrooms, and I've done it before as well, we kind of gloss over the runaway scrape and they burn their houses and left. But we don't really go into the details of what they experienced along the way. And that's the key piece, especially for students. So let's take a look at this together. And I want to show you guys what I've got for you. Specifically for the runaway scrape, I've got several different voices inside of the document. So going back to the lesson plan document that you guys have, hopefully, and maybe Jay will share that again in the chat, or maybe he already has. You can go ahead and click on the runaway scrape and the aftermath. So at the very top of this document, there's some background information provided by Dr. Torget. So it's absolutely fabulous, of course. And this is just to give the students an idea, if you have not taught the runaway scrape in your classroom, when you present this information, an idea of what's going on. I will say, I use this information, these primary sources, to really set up the events of the final events of the revolution, so that they can gain the human perspective before I start teaching the events, or before, I'm not sure what you guys do, but I show the video, I show the movie, the Alamo movie, because that starts at the Alamo, obviously, or before, and goes on into the very end to the Battle of San Jacinto. And so while they're watching that, they can remember these primary source documents, and it gives them a more human perspective, and it allows them to relate to those situations. And I will say this, I show the movie in a very annoying way. My students, very often, every year, they ask if my family watches movies with me anymore, because I pause and and maybe I annoy them a little bit while we're watching movies, but the answer is no, they don't typically watch movies with me anymore. So in case you're wondering. Anyways, back to the primary source document. Dr. Torget provided a ton of really, really good voices inside of his presentation. And so that's exactly what I've put inside of this document as well. These are the voices of Noah Smithwick, where he outlines all of the information, or like what it looks like. Okay, houses were standing open, beds were unmade. And the questions going along with this prompt students to form an opinion about, like, does it look like the people were prepared to leave? Why or why not? Use supporting text evidence. Eberly's in there, of course, because she's Eberly. She's got some strong opinions always, and I love using her information. She was talking about the riverbanks, and that, they're on foot, very few horses. There's like, they're sinking in the mud up to their knees. And I don't even like to walk in mud, mud puddles with my shoes. And so I can't imagine like trudging through all of this stuff in Texas, where the weather is ridiculous. And as Dr. Torget said, it was incredibly rainy. So there's no way around it. Like they're going straight through it. And then the great quote by Creed Taylor, I've never witnessed such scenes of distress, of human suffering. He sets it up as like, listen, people, this is real stuff. So I think these three documents together really outline the conditions of what they faced during the runaway scrape. Moving down to the bottom documents, this is the aftermath of the runaway scrape. So I've got Angelina Payton. She's one of the innkeepers. She's talking about how she goes back and everything is burnt. And basically she's saying, you know what, listen, I can't rebuild this. I'm just gonna scrap it and I'm leaving. I'm going back up to Columbia and I'm gonna open another tavern there, and I can't even deal with this anymore. So she leaves, she heads back home from where she came from. And then there's some more descriptive information. Dr. Torget talked about George Sutherland's wife and how she had lost her son and all of the struggles that she encountered. And so that information is in here because there was a question in the chat earlier about death during the Runaway Scrape. And yes, death absolutely happened. We see in Dalou Rose's account, which you'll see in just a little bit, that she lost a baby sister. That was incredibly painful for her family, but they had to keep moving on because they were running and trying to save their own lives and the rest of their family's lives. And fever broke out. I mean, like the worst possible situation that you could think of was happening to them during the Runaway Scrape. And so all of these documents, these quotes really nicely outline that information, and my students have responded incredibly well to this. And so the Runaway Scrape wasn't just like a glossed over point piece of the revolution. It was real, it was awful, and the true sufferers were the women, the children, and there are tons of accounts of the slaves that were with the women and children, and it showed how they were loyal. And so if you want to read more into that information, I want to point this out to you very quickly before we move on. If you want to read more about that information, the Reminisces of Miss Dalou Harris, this is Dalou Rose's journals all put together. This is volume 2, but there's plenty more. If you are interested and want to do some research on that, this is amazing. You can see exactly what happened through her words. But in just a minute, I've got a document for you, actually a couple of documents for you about Dalou Rose, and we're going to circle back to start back up with the Runaway Scrape. So I've got a couple of opportunities for you to teach the Runaway Scrape in your classroom through the voices of the ones that I just shared, and then through the voice of Dalou Rose, who will resonate well with your students because she was 10, turning 11 during the revolution, and they just eat that stuff up. So I'm going to stop sharing now and head on back to Andrew's screen, and he can give you the historical perspective of Dalou Rose. She's one of the most amazing accounts that we have because she journaled so much, and so she's very interesting. Looking forward to hearing what Dr. Torget says.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I just, every time we hand it off, I get to look at the chat, and I'm always amazed at the conversations that are happening. And you guys are anticipating a lot of things that we're going to continue talking about. So there are questions about runaway slaves during the runaway scrape, slaves and the runaway scrape. I'm going to talk about that in a second. We're going to talk a little more about that on Thursday. There's a question about Emily West, who's been called Emily Morgan. Her last name wasn't actually Morgan. It was Emily West, and we know that for a couple reasons that we'll get to talk about, and the Yellow Rose question of San Jacinto. So we're going to talk about some of that tomorrow. I'm going to share my screen again, and we keep referencing Dalou. And she is, as Michelle was just saying, and I couldn't agree with her more, an amazing story, and she provided one of the most detailed accounts of the Runaway Scrape. And so for her, it's a wonderful opportunity to bring into our classroom a first-hand account of somebody from the Texas Revolution and the Runaway Scrape. And what's particularly powerful about that is that Dalou was, as Michelle just said, 10 going on 11 years old at the time of the revolution itself. So she was about the age of our 7th graders, right? Which I think helps them relate to these sorts of things. So Dalou, we actually have a picture of Dalou. So she later got married and became Dalou Harris. And so when, her reminiscences are called the Reminiscences of Dalou Harris, but at the time she was Dalou Rose. And as I said, she was very young at the time of the revolution. So the picture on the left is Dalou. I'm using the picture on the right. That's not Dalou, but it's a girl about the right age at about this period in the 19th century, would have been 10 going on 11. And I love that she has her little sister next to her, because Dalou had several siblings, and she had a little sister that was a part of the Runaway Scrape as well. And so I use this image with my students to remind them, like, these are very young people in many of these cases. We have pictures of them when they're older, but they were very young when they experienced all of this. And let me just tell you the story of Dalou, right? She and her family came to Texas in the early 1830s, right? And when they came to Texas in the early 1830s, they came during the period when Mexico was outlawing American immigration into Texas. right? Remember I said that there's this big migration from 1830 to 1835 because of that cotton explosion that happens. Well, that's what the Rose family is doing. They're coming in and they set up a cotton farm fairly near modern day Houston as a part of the Austin colony. And her dad's growing corn and cotton and doing all that farming. And he's a part of this big migration that's happening just on the eve of the Texas Revolution. And it is at their farm that they start seeing the effects of the revolution very quickly. Dalou writes in her memoirs that men were leaving the plantations to go join the armies. And so a lot more work fell to the women and the children to tend the fields of corn and tend the fields of cotton, because the fall is cotton picking season. So when the Texas Revolution began, that's the period where women and the children are tending to the cotton fields because the men are away and they're having to shoulder pretty much all of this responsibility. And she's at her home near Stratford Point when news of the fall of the Alamo arrives. And that's the first thing they hear about real fighting in the Texas Revolution after the Battle of Gonzales is the fall of the Alamo. So when Susannah Dickinson brings in that news to Gonzales, it spreads like wildfire from there, and it gets to Dalou's ears as news is brought to her farm. And again, you can imagine what this is like because she describes it in great detail. So I'm going to give you guys a lot of quotes from her memoirs that really walk through. I'm going to let her tell, in many ways, much of this story about what she experienced. And so she writes, on the 12th of March, so that's only 6 days after the fall of the Alamo, came the news of the fall of the Alamo. A courier brought a dispatch from General Houston for the people to leave. Colonel Travis and the men under his command had been slaughtered. The Texas Army was retreating, and President Burnett's cabinet had gone to Harrisburg. And Dalou was particularly broken up because she had met Travis. Travis had stayed at their house at a certain point, and so she knew Travis. And now he's dead. All the men in the Alamo are dead. Everyone's retreating. It's terrifying. She said, and then thus began the horrors of the Runaway Scrape. And I think that's important. She remembers this as the horrors of the Runaway Scrape, right? That's her description of it. It wasn't this, joyful little fun journey we took. This was the horrors that we experienced. And they left home that day, right? We go back to Noah Smithwick's account and Guy Bryan's account saying people left everything on the tables. That's essentially what happened. They left at sunset as fast as they could, hauling clothes, bedding, and provisions on the sleigh, with one yoke of oxen. And Mother and I were walking, she with an infant in her arms, right? So her mom has a newborn baby that she's bringing, and much like Susannah Dickinson, right? Nursing them as they go, trying to escape with all of this, right? And so they lived down here. So you guys see in this map right here, this road heading toward, this is the Opelousas Road that goes towards Louisiana. They're going to escape on this road right here, right? This is where they're going to be heading to. They're over here in the eastern part of Austin's colony, and they make their way going eastward along this particular road towards, and then they go past Liberty itself. So this is the road they're actually moving on, the Rose family, as they're making their way eastward, right? And, as they're going, they're having a hard time and dealing with the muddy roads that we talked about, carts stuck in mud up to their axles, people throwing things out left and right, panic every which direction that you can possibly imagine. They're experiencing all of that. And they're experiencing in particular the backups at the river. And Dalou spent a lot of time talking about how terrifying that was to be backed up at these particular rivers, right? Every time they got to one of these rivers, you'd have a stack of families trying to get across on that little ferry that would take them across. He describes arriving at the San Jacinto River, and they got there at night, like in the night. They went day and night trying to get away as fast as they could. And she says there were fully 5,000 people trying to get across the river when they got there. Think about that. You come up to this thing in the dead of night, and there's just a sea of people in desperate flight trying to get away. She says the planters from Brazoria and Columbia with their slaves were crossing. We waited 3 days before we crossed. Everyone was trying to cross first, and it was almost a riot. Can you imagine waiting 3 days to get across when you think literally any minute Santa Anna's army could ride up behind you and kill all of you, right? Utterly terrifying. And her point here about the planters of Brazoria and Columbia were waiting with their slaves to cross is really important too. So one thing that happened, and we'll talk about this a little more tomorrow, is that as Santa Anna's armies marching in, enslaved people would sometimes, when they had the opportunity, run away to Santa Anna's army to get freedom. This happened during the American Civil War when Union armies marched around. Slaves would run away from the Confederates to freedom. It happened in the Texas Revolution as well. And so planters moved their slaves east as fast as they could to get them out of there, to get them to Louisiana, to get them away from Santa Anna's army. And Dalou remembers that there were more slaves than white people at many of these crossings, right? And she writes about that in her memoirs. As they're moving along and they get across the San Jacinto River, they keep pushing in this rainy, muddy, boggy circumstance that's not terribly healthy. And so some people were asking in the chat, did people get sick? Did people die? Did people survive all of this? And the answer is people got sick. A lot of people got terribly, terribly sick, right? Dalou writes about this. She says, measles, sore eyes, whooping cough, and pretty much every other disease that man, woman, or child is heir to broke out among us. And we see this in a whole lot of different accounts that people got sick. It was terrible circumstances. You're also crowding a lot of people around each other at the rivers. And as we all know, for those of us who teach in schools, that when you get a lot of people around each other, they share all kinds of things. And so it's the river crossings that become these like super spreader locations of every kind of communicable thing that would be brought into these areas. And so people got sick and got sick very quickly. And people died as a result of all of this. Dalou's younger sister, so in this picture here, you know, the stand-in I have for Dalou over here, the older sister, you can imagine her younger sister over here gets sick. She develops diarrhea and becomes very dehydrated. She develops a very high fever and at a certain point starts going into convulsions. Now, if that was my child, I would drive to the emergency room immediately because I can do that. None of these people have that option available to them, right? Their father, who's with them, brings the child up onto the saddle next to him and he holds her so she doesn't have to walk. But they got to keep moving to survive. And they do until she dies. And so Dalou's little sister dies as a result of the rigors of the Runaway Scrape. And so I want to emphasize again, women died in the revolution. Women died as a part of the violence and chaos of all of this. And especially children were especially vulnerable to all of this. They buried her little sister near 3 miles away from Liberty, Texas. And then they had to keep going. Can you imagine having to bury your child and then move on? I can't even begin to fathom. When the Battle of San Jacinto itself happened, the Rose family was close enough to the battlefield that they could actually hear the cannons thundering in the distance. And we know this because Dalou said it. She wrote it in her memoirs. And had this beautiful account of what it was like to hear the Battle of San Jacinto from a distance, right? They're running as fast as they can. They say, on Thursday evening, all of a sudden, we heard a sound like distant thunder. I love that. I love that quote, like distant thunder. When it was repeated, more cannons. Father said it was a cannon and that the Texans and Mexicans were fighting. She's literally recounting like the conversation. You can imagine them going and also you hear a distant boom, boom, boom. And then their father saying that that's a battle, that the Texans and Mexicans are fighting. And then they get panicked because the cannonade lasted only a few minutes, which we know the battle, you know, devolves very quickly. It's only an 18-minute fight. And father tells them that the Texans must have been defeated or the cannons would not have ceased firing so quickly. So they think this is another, just like the Alamo, they lost. Goliad, they lost. We must have lost again. And that means, because they can hear the cannons, that Santa Anna's army is very close. So they take off as fast as they can, going east, again, trying to push as quickly as they can to get away, right? They're a little past Liberty at this point. They're moving eastward, just as skedaddling as quick as they can. And then the next day, as they're doing that, a rider comes tearing up the road behind them. You can imagine just how scary that would be. Like, who's coming, right? They flip around and it's a Texan rider who comes up, and he has news that San Jacinto battle had happened and the Texans had won and Santa Ana had been captured, and you can turn around, he said. You can all come back. There were a lot of families who did not trust him and did not trust that news. They said, nope, we've come too far. I'm not taking a chance on my family. And they keep going east, right? So the runaway scrape continues for some families even after San Jacinto. Other families, like the Rose family, decide they can trust this news, and they turn around and they start heading back west, heading back to their homes. And what's really amazing about this, and you can read this in the memoir of Dalou Harris/Rose, that what they come back to is a landscape that's been utterly decimated by the Texas Revolution, right? They cart into San Jacinto just days after the battle itself. And when they get there, the battle's just happened. There are dead everything everywhere, mostly soldiers from Santa Anna's army. There have been dead who have they've been blown to pieces. They've had their heads bashed in. They're bloating out in the sun. They're all laying out there, 630 corpses rotting in the sun, along with dead horses and everything else all over the field. Dalou described this in the aftermath as, I love her spelling here, this is what my son would write, but gruesome sight when they got to the battlefield. And they, the Rose family, spent an entire day at the San Jacinto battlefield, looking at the gore, visiting the Texan camp, gawking at the Mexican POWs, about 700 of them, all grouped up around an open field area. And what Dalou writes in the aftermath, what she remembers most is the dead bodies absolutely everywhere that remained unburied. That Peggy McCormick demanded Houston bury, and Houston refused to have anything to do with. And we know Dalou was right because there are other visitors to the battlefield at that time who wrote similar things. There's a guy named John Quitman, who was a former governor of Mississippi, who tried to be a part of the Texas Revolution, but he got to San Jacinto right after the Battle of San Jacinto. And he wrote a letter back to his wife in Mississippi describing what San Jacinto looked like. And he said pretty much exactly what Dalou said. The ground is literally strewed with dead Mexicans, what John Quitman wrote. And so Dalou and her family visit all this. Remember, she's 11 when she sees all of this. She's 11 when she experiences all of this. And then after that, they continue their carts. She said her dad had to move off the road to avoid running over dead soldiers who are all over the ground. And then they get past San Jacinto and they camp in an open prairie, as she describes it. And that night, this is always a haunting detail for me, they hear the wolves howling and barking as they devoured the dead, right? Can you imagine sitting by the campfire in the aftermath of this and hearing nature devouring these dead men, these corpses out on the battlefield? I know this is a lot more gore than you're probably going to take into your classroom with your students, but I think it's worth remembering that this was real. This was real war. This is real carnage. This is real death. And that people really experienced all of these things, not in a movie sort of, kind of way, but in the horrific gruesomeness that Dalou describes, right? And that's also true of the landscape that they rode back into, right? Because again, Santa Anna's army, Sam Houston's army destroyed so much on their way to the Battle of San Jacinto. And as they're moving in, as they're going through this landscape, they're burning towns, they're burning places. Dalou writes about San Felipe being burned. Dear old Harrisburg is in ashes. There's nothing left of the Stratford plantation but a crib with 1,000 bushels of corn. I mean, you're riding past these burned, destroyed places that had been the infrastructure that you depended on. And she describes that. Like, that's a real hardship for everybody who's returning, right? So here she describes the burning of a sawmill, right, at Harrisburg, and the building on the Stratford plantation, which was a plantation near her home, was a calamity that greatly affected the people. Because this is not an era in which you can just go down to Walmart or Home Depot, like I keep saying, right? Getting resources on the frontier is a very difficult thing. So the destruction of all these places meant you weren't going to get lumber. You weren't going to be able to process your cotton at a cotton gin. You weren't going to have a blacksmith shop or a grist mill where you could process things or deal with stuff. You were out there on your own to fend for yourself in the aftermath of this and try to rebuild your home. And when the Rose family gets back to their home, they arrive back at their home at the very end of April, almost I think April 30th at 10 p.m. They come up in the dead of the night and they have to camp outside their house because they don't know what's in the house. They don't have flashlights they can go into it with. So they wait till the next morning. And when they go into the house, they see it's been absolutely torn up. Santa Anna's army had come to their plantation. Santa Anna's army had come through and arrived at their plantation. So it's a good thing they did leave. And Santa Anna's army had torn up their house. It ripped up all the floorboards, looking for hidden things and food and whatever they could get to provide for themselves as they were marching westward after Sam Houston's army. So their house is destroyed, all right? Their stuff is thrown everywhere. They dug up a chest that they had buried that had, clothing and some bedding that they had hidden and a few small valuables. But it's time to rebuild. And that's the thing about the end of the revolution. I think we need to remind our students is that they didn't just go back and things were normal and fine all of a sudden, right? It's like after Hurricane Harvey and all the homes that are destroyed in Houston, like the necessity to rebuild is what they have to confront at the very beginning of the aftermath of the Texas Revolution. And so they rebuild their homes. And this is something we'll talk about on Friday in particular. They go back to their cotton fields. And one of the things that Dalou talks about is the very first thing her father does when they get home is he finds his plow that he had hidden and he goes back to plow the fields, because planting corn to eat and cotton to sell is how they're going to survive the year to come. And this becomes the epicenter of Texas rebuilding itself in the aftermath of the revolution as they start to build a republic. With that, I'm going to stop and hand it back to Michelle to give you guys a couple of resources on the Dalou Rose story. And then we're going to throw you guys into some breakout rooms and have some conversation.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Torget. That was fantastic information as always. I've got some additional information about Dalou Rose for you guys that I told you about earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and go to screen share and go through this fairly quickly so that you guys will have enough time to chat in your breakout rooms. But going back to the lesson plan document, I'm on the very last part of it, and I'm going to go straight to the primary source analysis for Dalou Rose. During Dr. Torget's speech or his presentation, he gave you guys a whole slew of fantastic quotes from Dalou Rose's journals. And so that's what I've used inside of this. That's what you're going to see. And I want to briefly give you a rundown of what this is going to look like, because this is fairly long. So I've sectioned it out for you in 3 parts. This is part 1, the Runaway Scrape, or her accounts of the Runaway Scrape, along with questions. Part 2 is her account of the Battle of San Jacinto, and then the aftermath of the Battle of San Jacinto. And the very last part is the aftermath of the Runaway Scrape, and then when they finally get home. The reason it is in this order, in this timeline, is because that's exactly how it was in her journal. Okay, so I've used the same timeline that she used in her journal. And so the aftermath of the Runaway Scrape isn't tagged on to the very top with the Runaway Scrape. If you choose to do that, you can totally manipulate it and do it in that way. But I wanted to keep it pretty much true to, or actually true to her timeline that she set up for us. So moving back up to the very top, I'm just going to point out a couple of the events that she talked about, okay? Document A is really the introduction. They hear that the Alamo has fallen, and then just as Dr. Torget talked about, then begin the horrors of the Runaway Scrape. The question down here that relates to that is, like, she sets it up this way, okay? She tells us, then begins the horrors of the Runaway Scrape. What's your reaction to that? What do you think is going to happen during the Runaway Scrape? It doesn't sound like a walk in the park. It sounds awful. It sounds horrible. So we continue on to the crossing of the Trinity River. right here, she talks about her sisters getting very sick. Okay. And then moving on to the very bottom part of that, or actually the second part below that, my little sister that had been sick died and was buried in the cemetery. That's a moment when my students like step back and I say, hey, listen, like this really happened. Can you imagine? Because many of you have younger brothers and sisters, or even older brothers and sisters. And can you imagine one of them dying along the way? And as parents, we can't even imagine that. And so that's like a moment of like, I want you guys to, I would suggest that you guys really highlight that moment of just complete and utter heartache for her and her parents, but they move on. They have to keep going. So the very last question in that really prompts them to think about the bad news that they got. Fannin and his men were massacred. Well, what are we talking about there? She talks about Fannin and his men were massacred in the very last part of her statement. I didn't even say that to you guys, but I'll go back up and show you. The Mexican army had crossed the Brazos, and Fannin and his men were massacred. That, that's another way to introduce the events of the revolution. She hears it. They're horrified by that news too. Like, it's just not getting better for them. Like, as they go, they just keep getting this news of more people are dead, just like the Alamo, and this is not looking good for us. Okay, so part 2, Battle of San Jacinto. This is some good stuff. Okay, I put the excerpt in there for the part that they're hearing the Battle of San Jacinto. Dad thinks, hey, listen, we've lost another battle. Let's get out of here. Okay, and we're close enough to hear it. Surely they're coming after us. They get out of there, and then there's a little brief bit of good news, and I've included that down here because as they're running and fleeing yet another time, it says right here, no danger, turn back. And so what I want my students to do with that is really realize the moment when they hear that. Do they believe that when they first hear that? Probably not. If I'm running for my life for over a month now and trying to protect my family, I'm not initially going to believe the first person that runs up and says, you know what, it's all good. So I have a prompting question below to kind of interact with that information. And then document B. Let's take a look at document B for a little bit, because the first part of it says, I was on the battlefield of San Jacinto on the 26th of April, 1836. The 28th was the anniversary of my birth. I was 11 years old. She celebrated her 11th birthday on the battlefield of San Jacinto 5 days after the battle had happened, surrounded by 630 dead Mexican soldiers who had been rotting for 5 days. I mean, that's probably not the 11th birthday celebration that all students could ever hope for, but that's what she had. And so Dr. Torget said, maybe you wouldn't tell your students of this gruesomeness, but I do, because it's relatable, it's real, it's something that, while we're talking about the women of the revolution, the boys are really like, oh, that's good stuff. Maybe now I'm a little bit interested in the women of the revolution instead of not being. And so I always include this stuff. There's some things that I monitor, but a lot of this stuff is war, right? And so it talks about that they stayed on the battlefield for several hours as her dad, she's sitting among dead bodies for hours, waiting on her dad to finish up work. And then they even her dad stops as they're leaving that night. Also it's late, it's getting dark. How creepy is that? I'm sure that the kids would very much relate to, kids go and play in a cemetery at night. Don't tell them to do that, but that kind of creepy story, she's among dead bodies at night. Her dad moves one of the Mexican soldiers out of the way so that they don't run over him. Just cool and awful details all at the same time. And so then they go back, and I've included the information about the wolves howling and devouring the dead. Again, just awful stuff for an 11-year-old on her birthday. I just can't imagine. And so I've included information or questions about her birthday account or her birthday celebration down here. Like, how do you think she felt about that? And then I asked another little personal tag on there. Can you remember when you were disappointed about a birthday celebration, like it didn't go quite right, or maybe you didn't get the gift that you wanted? How does that relate to Dalou's 11th birthday? It really doesn't compare, right? So it kind of puts them into perspective a little bit. And then moving on to part 3, this is when they come back, they see everything burned down. Just as Dr. Torget was sharing, she says that, you know, like, gosh, our whole community is burned down. How might our house look once we get there? As a child, I'm sure she's thinking, like, my toys, my bed, my stuff, it's probably gone. And there's an account here when she's talking about they see their house. Everything's strewn all over the place. Like the pigs are inside the house. I can't even imagine. Like sometimes it's hard for me to let my dogs in all the time because I don't like the way dog smell is in the house. And so pigs in the house is probably a different story. So I point out some of those, you know, again, human aspects of these things. And at the very bottom of document B, this is kind of the big statement and the big closure of this. It says, mother was very despondent, depressed, like she's done. And I gave a vocabulary translation down here, but father was hopeful. He said that Texas would gain her independence and become a great nation. So the very last question that I've got down here about Dalou making that observation between her mom and her dad, I asked the students to pick a side. Like, we've gone through all of this, they've experienced this as Dalou would have. They know what they've been through, they've got the details of the gory, awful, disgusting stuff. Would you side with mom? Would you be done? Would you be ready to move on? Go back home. This doesn't feel like home anymore. I don't want this. I can't do this anymore. I lost a child. I lost everything that I knew as a woman. She probably doesn't even feel like a woman anymore. And dad is like, nope, we're staying because Texas is going to be great. So I asked the students to pick a side. Which one would they choose and why? And then I've got one more document for you guys to take a look at. It's the exit tickets. And if I have my people out there that suggested the tweet, here you go. When you guys gave me that idea the other day and said, man, Twitter would be really good, like having them create some kind of tweet would really relate it to modern day. I loved that idea. So I came back to my computer and kind of redid this for you guys. So here's the tweet that you requested. It's not that fancy. You can change the wording, you can change the rules, all that kind of stuff. But here's what I want my students to do. I want them to think about when Dalou gets home, I want them to create a tweet from Dalou and a hashtag, by the way. And it's really just like this simple statement of what's the best part of being home? Like, I'm thrilled to be home because I don't have to deal with yada, yada, yada anymore. Hashtag something more creative that I can think of right now. So this, I've put 2 of them in there, gave you a great dotted line to cut on so that you don't have to use that much paper. I'm sure your district will be happy about that. But there's your tweet. Again, you can change that any way you would like. You can prompt them to answer a different question, but that's your exit ticket for Dalou. And that ends my sharing information for that. I'm going to stop sharing wherever that is.